I left that doctor's office, and that was the beginning of the rest of my life. And that was when I realized I had to change the way I was living. I had to help other people. I had to help other people wake up as to the problems of modern living, not just the toxic food system and the toxic environment that we're all in, but also the toxic aspects of workaholism and giving up all things that make us human.
Hello, and welcome to Pursuing Health. I'm Dr. Julie Fouché, family physician and former CrossFit Games athlete. Here, I bring you information and inspiration to help bridge the gap between fitness and medicine and support your journey toward your healthiest self. Thank you so much for joining me. Now let's get started with this week's episode. Welcome back to Pursuing Health. I am very excited to be here today with Jason Karp. A little bit about Jason before we dive in. He is the founder and CEO of HumanCo, which is a mission-driven company investing in and building brands focused on healthier living and sustainability. He's also the co-founder of Hu Kitchen, which created the #1 premium organic chocolate in the US. You may know it. My mom's the #1 fan. He's also the co-founder, after spending over 21 years in the hedge fund industry, where he led a $4 billion investment fund, Jason shifted his focus to fixing the broken food system in the U.S. As a longtime activist investor, he's been a vocal advocate for cleaner options and continues his fight against the use of harmful ingredients, including launching a shareholder activist suit against Kellogg's for their use of artificial food dyes. His efforts focus on promoting transparency in the food industry while also addressing the prevention and treatment of autoimmune diseases, chronic illnesses, and childhood obesity. So thank you so much for joining me, Jason. I am so excited to dive into all aspects of your story. It's a real pleasure to be able to spend some time with you.
Thank you for having me.
As we heard in your bio, you are on this mission to restore our food system back to the way that humans were meant to eat, but it hasn't been, like most great stories in human lives, it hasn't been a straight path to get there. So I'd love to start just with your story and how you ended up in the place where you are today. And as we heard in your bio, before food, you had this 20 plus year career in finance. So how did you first end up in finance to start?
Yeah, it's been a long road in getting here. I had a pretty average childhood. Grew up middle class. I was a pretty good tennis player, which helped me get into college. But nothing really significant other than the fact that I had chronic health problems as a kid. I was always sick. Terrible allergies, chronic sinus infections, probably, 100 rounds of antibiotics before I was 19 years old. And also had fairly significant ADHD, which was undiagnosed at the time, but clearly looking back on it and now understanding a lot about ADHD and attentional issues, I was probably like a 9 out of 10 in terms of how bad I was. And I miraculously got into Penn, long story, but was in the transferred from being pre-med into the Wharton School. My father was a businessman growing up, and I always wanted to be a businessman and an investor. Wharton undergrad is the best undergraduate business school in the country. And so I was sort of honored and almost pinching myself that I actually made it there, despite all of the stuff I had to deal with growing up.
Well, I'd love to dive into that, because I know there's an interesting story of how you ended up in Wharton and a kind of a pivotal moment when you took an econ class, correct?
Yeah. So, I had just a tremendous amount of insecurity for a long period of my life. I was kind of known as the class clown. My teachers always, in my report cards, would tell me that, or tell my parents, that if I could only sit still, if I could only focus, I had potential. And when I got to Penn, I was shocked that I was even there in the first place because I didn't do particularly well in high school. And I was an athlete when I got to Penn. I was supposed to play tennis, and I actually switched to squash because I had a dislocated shoulder. And because of the athletic schedule, one of the requirements of Penn, and this is when I was pre-med, one of the requirements was econ.
Wow. I'm glad that wasn't a pre-med requirement in Michigan because I didn't have to take it.
And there were two econs. There was a Penn version, which was the College of Arts and Sciences version, and then there was a Wharton version of econ.
Okay.
And everyone had warned me and told me, do not take the Wharton version because the Wharton version was all Wharton kids. And the criteria to get into Wharton was substantially higher than the criteria to get into Penn. The criteria to get into Wharton was higher than Harvard, Stanford, MIT. It's the highest of any any university in the country. And it's basically the valedictorians of every high school, which I wasn't even close to in high school. But because of my athletic schedule, I had to take the Wharton version, which was terrifying to me. And it was a group of like 200 kids, one of those big lecture halls. And at that point, my parents were so happy that I was at Penn. We weren't even thinking about like what kind of grades I would get. And for some reason, when I started learning econ, it kind of came to me almost like a second language. And I didn't really pay attention to it. And I was still a bit of a hooligan. I didn't have good study habits. And we were about to take our first exam, which was about a month into school. And I didn't even study for it. And I ended up taking the exam, feeling like I did fine. And when I got the results back, they explained to us what a curve was. And I didn't know what a curve was. And they basically explained, what the mean was and the median and the high and the low. And long story short, I looked down at my test. I wasn't even processing the curve concept, but it was something like high 50s was like the mean on this test. Like if you got like a 60, it was like a B.
That's like great, yeah.
And I got a 91.
Wow.
And then when the teacher was writing the stuff on the board, the professor, he put the max and the min. And the min out of the whole class was a 0. Someone actually got a 0 on the exam. And the max was a 91. And this kid who was sitting next to me, who was this sort of like classic, like kid who was trying to be Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. There were kids in Wharton when I went there who would sometimes show up in like suits, and they would read the Wall Street Journal in class. And I thought this was like absurd. And he looks over at me and he would like saw my score and he goes, "That's the kid who got to 91.
Oh boy.
And I turned bright red. I felt like I was being punked. I couldn't understand how this was even possible, that I got the highest score. And I had this rush of embarrassment. And then I had this rush of pride where I thought, you know what? I don't know how this happened, but something magical just happened. And I have a chance to remake myself after being the underachiever my entire life with a huge imposter complex. And I'm actually going to try now in college and see what I can do. And that began my kind of ascent in going from underachiever to overachiever and really testing the limits of my own work ethic, my own intellect, what I was capable of doing. And when I spoke to my father, who was a businessman, he said, you know what, if you're really this good at business, maybe you should transfer to the Wharton School out of pre-med. And that was how I ultimately transferred into Wharton. And from then on, I, figured out how to deal with my ADHD. I kind of became a super learner. I kind of learned how to hack my own mind and what my mind, because I was very good at hyper focus. Typical with a lot of ADHD people is they can't focus on things that are boring to them. But if things are really interesting to people like me, you can hyper focus better than most people. And I had taught myself how to make everything that was not interesting interesting. And once I could teach myself how to make things that were boring interesting, I could hyper focus better than most and I could learn faster than most. And that allowed me to do extraordinary well in college, especially relative to high school, where I was totally average. And for a while, I thought this was a good thing. I was a 4-year college athlete, academic All American, academic All Ivy. Graduated top 3 of my class. I was the top student athlete in the entire university, and totally surprised everyone around me, including myself and my parents. But I started to teach myself some habits that ultimately became very, very suboptimal, which I didn't realize at the time, which is I had developed these habits of the more I believe I can do, the more I should do. And, in psychiatry, sometimes they call this a God complex, where you think you're capable of literally doing anything and you push it too far. And yeah, and I think what was happening to me was I started because I became so obsessed with productivity. I became so obsessed with success. I became so obsessed with the acquisition of knowledge that I started to ignore some of the more human and spiritual elements of what keeps people healthy. So I started teaching myself how to sleep less. I started looking at everything in my life in a cost benefit analysis. And a lot of things that are beautiful in life, you can't do a cost benefit analysis on easily. So that includes exercise, that includes friends, that includes family. Um, and I ended up getting a very coveted job coming right out of college. I went straight to a hedge fund out of college as a 21-year-old, where I had an ability to make an extraordinary amount of money very, very young. And I had some money trauma from my childhood, where I always believed that making money was the answer to happiness, was the answer to sort of solving some of my deep insecurities about who I am and why I'm here. Which of course was misguided, but I think a lot of kids, particularly who are raised by middle class parents who want their kids to be more successful than they were, I think this is quite common. And in my first 2 years of working, I had this very unusual dichotomy happen, which was I became the youngest partner in my firm's history and made more money than I had ever dreamed of in my first 2 years of working. But at the same time, I started getting very, very sick. And it started off with some autoimmune diseases. I started showing up with eczema and then psoriasis. My hair started falling out in clumps. I started having brain fog, all while on the surface and at work, it looked like everything I was doing was amazing. And the money and the accolades that I was receiving from my bosses was just a reinforcing positive loop that made me think like this is fine. And I kind of was ignoring my health and I was ignoring all of the clues that were happening to me. And I had become like a machine. And I ended up many, many years later during therapy, and we can come back to this, but I adopted kind of a name for what that alter ego was, which I ended up having for almost 20 years, which we call Terminator Jason. Because I was a cyborg version of I think what I should have been. And anyway, 2 years into working, I started going blind. And the doctors, I went to multiple doctors, and I was diagnosed with a degenerative eye disease for which there's no cure. And they said I would be fully blind by the age of 30. Uh, and I was very sick at the time. I felt like and I was going blind, except that I was very proud of what I was doing at work. And it was very hard for me because I didn't really talk about this with people. I didn't even talk about the extent of how bad I was with my parents. I hid it from everybody because I was too proud, and I didn't want people to think that I was weak. And this was also at a time, this is the year 2001, 2002. This was also at a time when I think men being vulnerable wasn't accepted. And so I fell into a pretty dark, deep depression. And I had some form of divine inspiration that led me to think, you know what, I'm going to go against what the doctors are telling me. I'm not going to take any pharmaceuticals, and I'm going to see if I could cure all of this on my own, using food and lifestyle as medicine.
Which was not very commonly talked about at that time. I mean, nowadays, I think, functional medicine is more widespread and more known about, but that was not a concept that people were talking about in 2001.
Not at all. And in fact, it was also very early days of the internet. So there was not much online. This was obviously before social media. This was before smartphones. So there was very little information out there. And I had this naive hypothesis. My original job was as what you would now call a data scientist. Then it was called a quantitative researcher. So everything for me was data. Everything for me was research and data and what can be proven and what's out there and what isn't. And I was a voracious reader. And I started to connect some weird dots. We probably don't have time to go into it today, but I started to connect some weird dots between inflammation, ancestral eating, ancestral living, in terms of how indigenous peoples live and how they have none of our modern chronic ailments. Indigenous people have no allergies. They have no autism. They have no ADHD. They certainly have none of the ailments that I had. And I started developing this unique hypothesis then of maybe part of the reason I'm sick is I'm living completely at odds with how we as humans were meant to live. And so I adopted kind of an ancestral approach to living to see if I could heal all of my ailments. And the doctors said to me, that'll never work. You have a degenerative disease that's incurable. You just have to put your name on a corneal transplant list and hope for the best. And I said, you know what? You're giving me no hope. I'm going to do it anyway. And over, the first month, I noticed my skin diseases started to clear up. I noticed my hair stopped falling out, and I noticed my vision started coming back. And after 5-6 months of this, my vision had completely come back. And I went into the doctor's office, and thank God there's an objective test for this eye disease, because they didn't believe me when I walked in and I said, hey, I think I'm seeing clearly again. And they said, no, that's not possible. And I said, well, give me the test. And they have an objective test that measures the surface area of your eye and your cornea to see if the disease is present or not. And I was 100% clear. And the doctor said to me, he said, I overheard him because I was sitting in the chair, and I overheard him say, that's impossible. And he called over his colleague and he said, you got to come see this. And the other guy said, that's not possible. And then the doctor came up to me and he said, what did you do? And I told him, and he goes, nah, we must have misdiagnosed you. And I remember he was very arrogant and condescending. And I was so upset that he didn't actually want to ask, maybe this could work. And I left that doctor's office, and that was the beginning of the rest of my life. And that was when I realized I had to change the way I was living. I had to help other people. I had to help other people wake up as to the problems of modern living, not just the toxic food system and the toxic environment that we're all in, but also the toxic aspects of workaholism and giving up all things that make us human, like laughter and community and love and other people, and just the things that are harder to quantify.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really hard. But at that moment in time, I basically said to myself, I said, you know what? I'm going to stay in this profession, but I'm going to live differently. and I'm going to focus on ways in which I can still be successful in my job, but also figure out a way to live a life where I'm not dying.
Sounds like a good plan. I'm always so intrigued by what it is, like what was it about you that when you heard that diagnosis, you said, no, I'm not accepting this and I'm gonna find another way versus someone else who could have walked in that office and just accepted it as their fate.
I think one of the positives of my, let's call it neurodivergence, is that I never accepted authority. I was a complete hooligan in my youth. Most people who know me today can't even believe it unless they meet my friends from childhood. I was one of those kids that other parents would say, you can't play with that kid, because I got into so much trouble. And I don't know. I never accepted authority. And I always kind of had to figure it out myself. And I didn't accept it unless I directly experienced it. So I just naturally had this kind of anti-establishment approach to questioning it. And because they gave me no choice, it was pretty easy to be like, I'm just going to try it anyway, because my alternative is that I just go blind.
Right. You didn't want that. It's always so interesting to me, the qualities that maybe made life hard for you when you were a kid also served you in a lot of ways, to be able to make you ask these questions and not accept no for an answer.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think because I never really fit in well, I had to go through a lot of difficulty as a kid, and at the time it felt brutal to go through some of the traumatic stuff I went through, to go through some of the hardships I went through. It felt really unfair when I was living it. And now I'm deeply grateful for it, because it gave me such a different perspective on I think how to live a more fruitful life.
Wow. So you go through this experience, you're still in your early mid-20s, but you realize, okay, health is very important. I need to change some things personally, but also I want to share this with other people. So how did that then lead to the birth of Hugh Kitchen?
So I met my wife, Jessica, 3 months after I was fully recovered. And I actually told her this story on our first date, which was extremely risky, because I think most people would have thought I was an insane person. And I think Jessica thought a little bit that I was insane.
But she stuck around.
And, I think one of the things that I realized from my recovery was how important it was to have a really good partner that could help me stay grounded. I think because I had the workaholic tendencies, and I had the aptitude or potential to do a lot of things, I think if I sort of stayed alone, I could have built a bunch of things that were very financially successful, but I probably wouldn't be alive today. I probably would have been, you would have found me in a gutter. It was one of the few very mature things I think I did in that age, was recognizing I needed a partner who I could marry, I could grow old with, I could have as my rock. Jessica has been so incredibly important to me in so many ways, and she saved my life literally so many times. And it was, so I met her, just a few months after I recovered. And then, a few years later, her younger brother, Jordan, he and I would geek out on all the things that I was doing and all the books that I was reading. And this was very early days of biohacking, and there were very few books out, and there were a few functional medicine or holistic medicine doctors that had written books. It was right at the beginning of Dr. Mark Hyman. Dr. Andrew Weil was kind of a legend from the 80s. And my brother-in-law, Jordan, was reading all these, and he started trying what I was doing on himself. and he noticed how much better he felt, how much better he performed, how much better he looked. And he wasn't sick like me, but everything still got better for him. And he said to me one day, he said, this is amazing. He said, why isn't there a place to eat like this in New York City where we could basically have the manifestation of all these principles in one location? And I said to him, I said, Jordan, I'm a professional investor. Restaurants are very difficult businesses, and we have no idea what we're doing. And to his credit, he convinced me to want to create a restaurant that was the manifestation of everything we were doing.
Wow. So he made you go against all of your data mind to say.
Absolutely. And it took a while to convince me to do it. But I think selfishly, like, I wanted to have a place that I could eat every day, where I could trust everything in the restaurant. And I think the three of us as a family, we wanted to show the world and New York City that you could have amazing, delicious food without all of the synthetic, fake, hyper processed garbage. And Hugh Kitchen, it's called Hugh because Hugh stands for human. And our slogan, which was based on my own recovery, is get back to human. And it started as a restaurant. Most people who know our chocolate don't know that it started as a restaurant in New York City before it was a chocolate company. And the chocolate was a bit of an accident. We were making gluten-free, grain-free baked goods. It was a fast casual style. It wasn't a sit-down restaurant. And we wanted to, right before we opened, we wanted to have gluten-free, grain-free cookies, muffins, banana bread. We wanted all these things with chocolate in them. And by the way, we were seed oil free when we were even conceptualizing this in 2010.
Wow. So ahead of the curve.
Yeah. I mean, everyone thought we were nuts. And anyway, we had to create our own chocolate because we could not find chocolate that met our rigorous specs. And so we started creating our own chocolate with this consultant that had two ingredients, organic cacao and organic unrefined coconut sugar. We didn't want to use fake sweeteners. We could get into why we chose unrefined coconut sugar. But anyway, the chocolate we developed was so delicious. My brother-in-law said, we should turn these into chocolate bars and we should sell these in the restaurant. And I said, sure. And so we started selling them in the restaurant, and they were flying. I mean, people were coming in from out of state to buy our chocolate bars, and they were $10 a piece in the beginning. And I looked at Jordan and Jessica, and I said, hey, I think we got something with this. We should focus on the chocolate. And we had no outside investors at the time. It was just our family. And so that was the genesis of Hugh Chocolate.
Wow. That's wild. And I love too that, again, your quality of overachieving or obsession coming into the quality of what you were doing at Hugh Kitchen. And, even going in saying restaurant business is hard, it's not a great investment, but we're going to take that on. Plus we're going to take on the fact that we're going to have, the highest standards for our ingredients, which I'm sure was much more difficult and expensive.
Yeah, it was really hard. I mean, I've been financially blessed for a long time now with the various things I've done over my career. So I had the luxury to be extremely principled in how we started Hugh. I had the luxury of not having outside investors who probably would have told us to use cheaper ingredients and take shortcuts. I also believed very strongly, because of my own health journey, that you can do food without compromise. And I had studied so many other companies that once started with good intentions, with very clean ingredients, but they realized that if they started to take shortcuts and use more synthetic stuff and use more processing and use chemical alternatives instead of organic alternatives, they noticed that their margins were better because their costs would go down. And every major company that I had followed, and even some of the small companies I had followed, had all downgraded their ingredient quality over time because it increased the profitability of that business. And I, all of us, Jordan, myself, and Jessica, were all aligned that we would never compromise on our trust and on our authenticity and integrity for money. And we had a few moments where we had a problem where we had to make a decision between losing a bunch of money and keeping our integrity, or violating our integrity and making some money. And I'll give you a quick example. It's a fun one. So in the early days of Hugh Kitchen, the restaurant, we had a big breakfast business, and we were sourcing, pastured eggs, heritage bacon, from organic pigs. And we were crushing it in our breakfast business, and people loved our bacon. And of course, the bacon was not cured. So no nitrates, no synthetics, no chemicals. I mean, it was like, and one day the supplier of our bacon called us up and said, "Hey, I just discovered that we can't verify that this is organic anymore, because pigs," most people don't know this, but pigs eat slop. And to qualify as an organic meat, the animal has to eat organic material. And basically there was some commingling with the organic food, and the pigs were basically eating not organic stuff, and therefore the bacon is not organic anymore. And he said, "I can get you not organic bacon, or it's going to be a while and we don't know what's going to happen." And we had a moment, because we were making a lot of money on our breakfast. And, we decided, and we made a thing out of it. We told all of our customers, we said, "We're pulling the bacon off. We will not have bacon indefinitely until we can verify that it meets our specs." And it cost us a lot of money to do that. And we got great feedback from a lot of our customers, that they said, like, I've never seen a business that would voluntarily lose money to keep their integrity, at least in the food space. And we made many decisions like that over the later years. And I think that really helped establish Hugh as a highly trusted brand, because we weren't willing to take shortcuts, to compromise people for profits.
So you have Hugh Kitchen, the chocolate's taking off, but you're still working in the world of investment. When did that start to change, and did you start to realize maybe I want to do a career change?
I had, multiple moments of, I call it despair, over the course of the 20-year period that I was a professional investor. I worked for 3 other great mentors before I had my own hedge fund. I started my own hedge fund at the end of 2011. But throughout, even before I started my own fund, I would say pretty safely that I had chronic depression the whole time. And I would oscillate between modest depression to heavy depression, but never talked about it. And it was especially hard for me looking back on it, because on the surface, everything looked so good. I had, at that point, I was married. I had a child. My health was fine. It wasn't anywhere nearly as bad as it was when I was sick. And there were a few times I think I had reached out to a friend or two when I was really down, to try to at least talk about it. And again, I wasn't raised in a culture where you talked about your feelings a lot. And a few times I got shot down. A few times I would bring it up to someone and they would say, "How dare you be depressed? Like, you have money, you have a family, like, there's people who are starving. How dare you be depressed?" And it made me even have more shame. And so I was in really bad shape for a very long time, despite my financial success. I started seeking therapy to try to help me with more of a traditional psychiatrist, which was probably around 2012, right around the beginning of my hedge fund. And I just kind of felt like I don't know what I'm doing. I was very good at my job. Um, and I had the positive feedback loop of making a lot of money and being, quote, successful. But I think I hated myself, and I couldn't understand why. And I just knew for a very long time that this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'd also say that investing, uh, what I call passive investing, meaning where you're investing in other people's companies and you're not directly making things or producing things or directly helping people. Um, it's an extremely lucrative profession, and people like Warren Buffett have made it seem like it's a godlike job, but it's basically a professional video game. And you're not really adding value to society. And I tried to rationalize to myself that I was, because I was making all of my investors a lot of money, and they were then investing into things that might help the world and yada yada. But at the end of the day, I felt like my soul was rotting. And I even developed a phrase for it with one of my friends. We called it soul decay. Like I felt like our souls were decaying.
I like that word. I mean, I don't like the idea, but it's a good
Yeah,
description.
I felt like my soul was decaying, and the peak moment was actually in 2015, which was about 3.5 years into my own fund, when I'd been working so hard to be a very good hedge fund manager. We had our best year ever. We were the biggest we'd ever been. I had about 40 people working for me. We were managing about $4.5 billion, and I won a few different awards that are kind of like the Oscars for hedge funds, and with like trophies. And we got invited to this, exclusive event with all the top hedge fund managers in the world, and I go up on stage and accept the trophy and taking pictures with everybody. And I wanted to be so happy and proud. And I walked off the stage with the trophies in my hands, and I turned to Jessica, and I had this awful, hollow feeling like a pit in my stomach. And I said to Jessica privately, I said, I don't think I can do better than this. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, I've been working my whole career for this moment, and it feels hollow and empty. And like I achieved like 99.9th percentile of a hedge fund manager that you could do. And I felt disgusting and awful. And I also felt shame for feeling disgusting and awful. And so, and one of my mentors at one point, who was extremely successful, one of the most successful, financially in the United States. And he said to me one day, a long time ago, he said, I feel like I've gotten to the top of my mountain and there's nothing to see up there. And I'd felt like I'd been climbing that mountain for 17 years, and I got to the top and there was nothing up there. And so you have this awful existential angst of like, what do I do now? And that was the moment where everything flipped for me. And I knew that I probably had to get out and retire and do something else. And at the same time, thank God, Hugh was growing rapidly. And I was deriving so much joy and satisfaction from Hugh. Except Hugh was tiny. And like I couldn't make a living off of Hugh at that time. But the interactions I had with people, how we were helping people, the letters we received from people, how we were changing their lives. I knew that helping others was my calling, but I had this huge problem, which is I had this big company. I had an identity that was as a investor. I didn't think I was qualified to become a health and wellness entrepreneur or advocate. And I should have retired then. And Jessica was begging me to retire, in 2016. And then I had this unbelievably awful situation happen where my best friend and business partner of 16 years killed himself. And when that happened, I fell into the darkest depression of my life at that point. And I kind of knew I had to change something. And I knew that more success wasn't going to answer that at all. And I had to do a lot of soul searching. I was in the depths of that for a couple years. It was not like a quick realization because I couldn't just like close down my company. There were 40 people that worked for me. I had a lot of people relying on us and me, and I felt a duty. But I ultimately believed that I'm not going to be a good boss. I'm not going to be a good steward of other investors' capital. And I'm not going to be a good father or citizen if I stay in something that I know is rotting my soul. And that's what prompted the decision to return all the money from my hedge fund and technically retire, close down the fund. I wrote a long letter to my investors explaining how I came to this decision. And I was going to start a second company called HumanCo. And HumanCo was kind of the culmination of everything that I've ever done, where I wanted to build a company that could buy companies, could invest in companies, and could build companies like you in the health and wellness world that make it easier for people to live a healthier life. Because it's still, today you know this, but it's still so hard to live healthy with all of the deception, all of the challenges of the bullshit, the greenwashing. And I wanted to create more and be involved more with companies that were establishing trust and basically allowing people to get back to human. And that's why we named it HumanCo.
It's amazing. It's amazing to hear just the arc of your story and also like those pivotal moments. Like, what if you hadn't had the injury and switched to squash and taken the class at Wharton? Or, what if, if your friend's suicide hadn't happened and you didn't go into the deepest, darkest depression, would you have continued in finance for many more years? Like there's so many different events that happen in our life that, good or bad, tragic or happy, like end up changing the trajectory of our lives. And it's beautiful to see it, just to hear about these moments of yours. But I think that's a great segue into talking about our food system, because you're doing so much work here, and I would love for you to share some of the insights with listeners. It's a topic that we talk about a lot on the podcast, but it is, like you said, even today, it's not 2001 when you started your health journey. There's so much more information out there, the internet, functional medicine, a lot of companies that are focused more on health, but it is still extremely hard to know what's in your food and to eat in a way that is the way that humans were designed to eat. So you learned a lot about why we got where we are through your time investing and researching and understanding the way that these food companies work. Can you share a little bit about that? Like, how did we end up, like, from when our great grandparents ate food off the farm to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I testified about in front of the U.S. Senate, and we can come to that. But I think it's two major things. I think the first is that, and they're related to each other. The first is that the U.S. has a much looser and I would call it reckless regulatory approach to what we allow in our food supply. And what I mean by that are particularly the ingredients that are allowed to come into our food supply. And the second part, and then I'll tie them together. The second part is the rise of capitalism, and the rise of, this shareholder mindset, which is uniquely American. In the 50s and 60s, which was kind of the beginning of multinational corporations, and when things really started to kind of boom. If you take McDonald's as a very simple example, and I think it's illustrative, the first McDonald's was in the 40s, and it was a burger shack that had grass-fed meat, had potatoes that were fried in beef tallow. The French fries were just literally potatoes and salt. The burger was just a grass-fed burger from a cow that was on a farm that was grazing. The buns were fresh baked with very simple ingredients that your grandmother would make. And McDonald's, the first 5 McDonald's were actually healthy, the way we would think about healthy today. And when people saw how much money they were making and investors came in, they asked the natural question, which is, how do we scale this? How do we make more of these? And, the real advent of scale came actually from Henry Ford in the auto industry, when he basically figured out a way to create a factory line with efficiencies. And that mentality and that framework of scaling works very well. And it's worked in every industry, except that in food, the only way to properly scale, because the question that you would naturally have is, how do we make sure the burgers taste the same in Missouri as they do in California, as they do in New York, or even how do we make sure they taste the same in Tokyo? And how do we make sure that our consistency goes up? And how do we make sure that our profitability goes up? All of these natural capitalistic questions led to, we got to make sure that the cows are homogeneous and consistent, which means we got to turn them from animals into widgets. And we have to make sure that we don't have any bad batches. And we have to make sure that the potatoes are always the same. And so McDonald's single-handedly was one of the great impetuses behind industrial agriculture, because there was so much money that wanted to scale food. And now, now there's over 10,000 McDonald's. And now the French fries, which once had 2 ingredients, have 11 ingredients in them. Most of those ingredients are not foods. They're ingredients to ensure preservatives, to keep them shelf stable. They're ingredients to make sure that the fryer doesn't overflow with foam. And so a lot of kind of how we got here was this desire to make everything very consistent, very profitable, and to scale food the same way we scale iPhones, which obviously is a huge mistake. And the regulatory aspect to this is that the regulatory agencies, and this is obviously why we have the MAHA movement happening and why so many people have been advocating for RFK, the regulatory approach was basically co-opted by big business. And so in this country, if you are a food company and you design or engineer with your own chemists a new chemical that you think will add to the flavor, the texture, the shelf stability, whatever it is, you can create that synthetic on your own, hire a couple of independent experts. The independent experts write a paper that say this is fine and safe. They send it to the FDA and the FDA rubber stamps it. There's no studies, there's no tests. If you compare that, however, to Europe takes much more pride in their citizens' health. There's a whole another discussion as to why. But they have the opposite regulatory approach, where in the US, it's innocent until proven guilty. You create a new ingredient that no one's ever heard of. It's never been in the food supply. It's fine. Let's see what happens. 10 years later, we realize it causes cancer.
Giant experiment on all of our health.
Yeah. And by the way, there's a list of dozens of ingredients, pharmaceuticals that were once deemed safe, that once had studies, that 10 years, 15 years later were deemed to be a problem and were recalled or pulled. This was like early medications like thalidomide. Asbestos is the huge one. Just 3 weeks ago, Red 3 was finally banned. So there's a huge list of these ingredients, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. And I think Americans falsely presume that if the government gives it its stamp of approval, that it's safe and fine. And history shows you that's completely incorrect. And so Europe takes the opposite approach. They actually call it the precautionary principle, which is guilty until proven innocent. So if Julie creates her own new synthetic chemical and you want to add it to your own product, you have to pay for it. You have to test it sometimes upwards of 10 years of testing before you can bring it into their food. So we have 10,000 ingredients that are not approved in Europe. and they have 400 by contrast for the same foods. So we have 9,600 plus more chemicals, ingredients, synthetics, additives that they won't use in other countries. And that's how we got here, is that if you just take the role of capitalism and you take a semi-corrupt government agencies who were all just trying to grow business without thinking about the downstream effects on people, that's how you get here.
Yeah, there's no incentive to keep people healthy.
They don't bear the cost. So McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and, and again, like I want to point out, and gets controversial. Some of the executives that I have learned about or met, some of them are malicious, and they know this stuff causes harm. They're doing it anyway. The Kellogg CEO is one of those malicious people, which is why I filed my shareholder activist lawsuit against them. But most of the executives and most of these companies are good people, but they have a job and they report to somebody, and they have boards of directors, and the CEO answers to the board of directors, and their sole focus for how they get bonused and how they get rewarded and how they keep their jobs is growing profits. And so they're just doing what they're incentivized to do, which is grow profits. And they have zero penalty for if all of their customers develop diabetes over the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's for anyone, I think it's easy to just focus on what's right in front of you and doing your job or what you're incentivized to do. But then when you actually zoom out and look at what's happening on a bigger scale, it's quite scary. And I know you've talked about this meta crisis that we're in. Can you share what you mean by that?
Yeah. So I've been giving some speeches recently about what I call the meta crisis, which is a simultaneous crisis of physical health, mental health, and planetary health. And when you look across, and they're all interrelated, and I think a lot of people don't realize how interrelated they are. We are the sickest as a species, as humans, that we've ever been in human history. Chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, never been higher than they were in 2024.
And really, this has only been in the last several decades that really skyrocketed.
This went parabolic in the early 80s. Like you can look at it on charts where literally all of these chronic diseases just took a hook up in like 85. And there's a bunch of people who are trying to say, well, it was the seed oils, or it was the sugar, or it was this chemical, or it was the food dyes. I think it's a multitude of factors. I don't think there's one that's the silver bullet answer to this crisis. The mental health crisis is as severe, if not worse, in terms of mental health disorders, ADHD, autism. Suicide rates have never been higher. And then obviously the planetary health issues in terms of freakish weather patterns that have been happening. 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year storms are happening now once a year. You're getting all sorts of flukish events where, 69% the vertebrate population, which are all the animals that have bones, is down 69% in the last 40 years. And then when you look at things like fertility, men's sperm count is down 50% in the last 40 years. Women have never had a harder time conceiving children than they do today. And so you just look at all the data and it's overwhelming. And then you ask, well, wait a minute. We exercise more than we've ever had. We have more pharmaceuticals than we've ever had. We have more medical interventions and medical devices than we've ever had. We know more than we've ever known. Science has never been this advanced. And we spend more per person than we ever have. And yet we're the sickest we've ever been. So if you just look at it very simply and objectively, you have to say what we're doing is not only not working, it's a disaster. The more money we've been spending, it's actually gotten worse. And there's other countries that are doing way, way, way better than us. Most of the European countries live between 5 to 10 years longer than we do. They have far lower incidences of all those issues that I mentioned, and they spend half to a third per person on healthcare. And the one thing that they don't have, they make a little bit less money than we do. But then I ask you, like, what are we solving for? What are we optimizing for? Like, we want to be happy. We want to be thriving. We want to live into our 70s and 80s without being sickly. And so what we're doing is literally a disaster. And this is the meta crisis we're in. And, Albert Einstein has a very famous quote, which is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so I think the movement that's been happening with RFK and the broader Make America Healthy Again movement, and again, saying this without any politics, without any partisanship, has had so much interest because every single person in America, regardless of your education, can see how sick we are. You don't need to wait for the conclusive scientific studies of whether it was seed oils or whether it was forever chemicals or whether it was the plastics. We know all of it is not good. And we know other countries that are doing it way better than we are, who have totally different standards and totally different approaches to how they do it.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I want to get into some of the momentum and things that are starting to change this year, but you mentioned RFK Jr., Make America Healthy Again. And I think one of the most unfortunate things is that it has become a political, affiliation where, as you have stated many times, it shouldn't be. It's a human issue. It's something that all of us should be concerned about. But why? Can you just explain for people why it became political and why it shouldn't be?
Yeah. So as you probably know, RFK, who comes from the Kennedy family, is literally the most democratic family in U.S. history. He was a lifelong Democrat. You might even argue he was pretty left with some of his positions.
Well, even the food, like putting more regulations on food has traditionally been a more left approach, right?
The Republican right side has always been anti-regulation and freedom of choice. And anyway, he was running for president, which you may remember. And he was capturing probably between 10 to 15% of the polls versus Trump and Harris. And after Trump had his first assassination attempt, it was pretty clear to those involved that Trump was going to have a significant benefit from surviving the assassination attempt. And it was also pretty clear that there was no way an independent, particularly RFK, was going to win the presidency. And there were a handful of people, and Callie Means was very instrumental in this, that called the inner circle of RFK. I made a few calls. Callie was I believe, the real instigator, and basically said to Bobby, look, you're not going to win the presidency, but the positions that you have on chronic disease, which is the greatest single threat to our country and our existence today. And don't get lost in all the other things that people don't like RFK about or might mistake him about, including vaccines. 90% of our healthcare costs, which are bankrupting this country, we spend $5 trillion a year on healthcare. 90% is attributable to chronic disease. And there's so many stats that are so alarming as to the competitiveness, effectiveness of our country, as well as the future of our children. This is the first generation in human history that's supposed to live a shorter lifespan than their parents. And so a bunch of people and me basically got involved and said, look, Trump's probably going to win. The only way we're going to get these policies enacted, because this is the greatest problem we have today as a country, is if you join forces with Trump. And that seemed insane at the time. And to Bobby's credit, and thank God, he came around to it and he called Trump, and what the stories are is that they hadn't spoken in like a decade. Apparently they had a really good conversation. And then ultimately he ended up joining forces with Trump. to help in some way, shape, or form with the health policy. And that undoubtedly, and you see it in the polling data, that undoubtedly brought a lot of new voters to Trump who probably didn't like Trump as a person, may not have been even Democratic, may not have been Republican, but that issue was so important. And by the way, I put me and Jessica in that bucket. Historically, I voted Democratic. It has been a long time since I voted Republican. I'm personally not a fan of Trump as a person or his antics or his shenanigans. But I'm also looking at the existential problem that we're facing. And I think what was really hard for a lot of people is separating the man of Trump, who is obviously not likable, separating like some of the stuff he's done in the past from the policies and the fact that we're looking at the status quo and it's so bad that you have to break it. And you cannot break where we are with incrementalism. And so it became very political because people didn't want to do anything that supported Trump. The more time I spent in getting to know Bobby and the more time I spent in getting to understand Trump and some of his past shenanigans and, some of his character flaws and issues, the more I realized it's a very nuanced issue. And sadly, Julie, when it became clear that I was a big supporter of Maha, even without me declaring that I'm pro-Trump or pro-Kamala or any of that, like I lost some friends. I had some people that were so angry at me. How could you support RFK? That's an implicit endorsement of Trump. And like they weren't even willing to listen. And I think we're at such a sad moment of America where people aren't willing to listen to each other, where I have plenty of friends, good friends, that I violently disagree with them on certain topics. And they're still my good friends. And I think we need to have an ability to have empathy and to have tolerance for other people's views without it being an ad hominem attack on, oh my God, if you are a supporter of RFK, that means you're a bad person. And I just feel like our civility and our ability to get along has been destroyed because of these sort of left versus right dynamics.
It is remarkable just how polarizing it's become. And like you said, the inability to have conversations or to even to, there's so many times where I would like to have a conversation with someone, but it's like almost not worth it because it becomes so polarizing so quickly. And it's hard for people to actually be able to separate those strong feelings and have conversations about what's happening. But anyways, I think that, regardless of, people listening, what your thoughts are on RFK Jr., he's in the position he's in. What do you think what is the best possible outcome of this next 4 years when it comes to improving the health of our food system in our country?
Well, I think, look, the reason I testified in front of the Senate back in September, which is how I got to know Bobby well, was a seminal moment. The Senate Roundtable on Chronic Disease, which was at the end of September, I was invited to speak as a kind of businessman / activist. And that was really the beginning of when a lot of these conversations became topical because a lot of those videos went viral and a lot of people couldn't believe how poisoned our food system is.
You holding up the Fruit Loops from U.S. and from other countries?
I've become inadvertently known as the Fruit Loops guy for the guy who held up the 2 bags of cereal. But people had no idea. And guess what? Like the members of Congress had no idea that these companies were making a safer, better version of products in other countries than they were selling here. And so what it did was it created outrage. Like, what? They make a better version for Canada than they sell here? And then why do we have the shittier version? And we don't even have a choice. We can't get the better version, even if we wanted to. And so what has happened now that Bobby is the head of HHS, which is Human and Health Services, and oversees the FDA, has like a JV with the USDA, which regulates the dietary guidelines, obviously the CDC, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those things, is some very simple principles that I think we want to accomplish. The first is allowing what they're calling gold standard science to come back, where it's not corrupted by industry. So the people who are working and doing the research should not be paid for by the industry. And about half of the FDA's budget was coming from industry, just to give you a sense of how bad it's been. And most, I think it's the super majority of the people at the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, where the research is supposed to be objective. The super majority of the researchers have significant conflicts of interest in terms of accepting money from industry. So the first is just get conflicts of interest out so we could see like objective data.
Which you would think would be such a basic thing. Right?
You'd think that would be basic. The second, which is really easy and important, is adopting more of the European standards around protecting our people, around the regulation approach. So we shouldn't be allowing these new chemicals into our food supply unless they've been extensively tested before they come in. Like really simple stuff is a major aspect of what the new administration is going to try to do, which is the goal is to reverse chronic disease. The goal is to, for the first year ever, have a decline, which hasn't happened. And we know it's a multitude of factors. We know it's the plastics. We know it's the forever chemicals. We know it's the ultra processed food. We know it's the artificial food dyes that are in everything. We know it's the seed oils. We don't know what percentage contributes from each of those, but we know that these are all negative. And just kind of resetting everything and saying, you know what, let's go back to basics. Let's go back to the way it was 40, 50 years ago. And let's add some of these things back one at a time if they are proven to be safe.
They're tested first, right?
And that's really the goal of everything that RFK represents.
Which is really simple and common sense if you think about it. I don't know anybody who would disagree with the fact that if you're doing science, you shouldn't be influenced by industry. It should be pure science. And that, you know, we shouldn't introduce new chemicals into our food unless they're thoroughly tested.
And one more thing, Julie, that I think is really important. One of the things that a lot of people bristle at and get very upset about is how to reincorporate common sense into our policies. Many of these other countries that are doing way better than us use common sense without waiting for 10-year peer-reviewed controlled studies. As an example, we don't need 10 years of studies to know that eating petroleum and coal tar, which are what all of the food dyes are derived from, are not good when you have an alternative where you can make food colorants from fruit and vegetables. Europe takes the approach of like, of course you shouldn't be eating petroleum and coal tar. A lot of American people, particularly in positions of legislature or regulation, they make claims of we don't have enough data. It's not conclusive. We need 5-10 years more data before we can conclude that it's bad. And that's just insane. That's violating basic common sense principles that, like, you as a mother would never do that with your child. You'd never say, yeah, I'll feed this to my child for a decade, before I realize that it's a problem.
Right. It's wild at the expense of common sense.
I'm going to wrap up with 3 questions I ask everyone at the end of the podcast. So the first one is, what are the 3 things that you do on a regular basis that have the biggest positive impact on your health?
Number 1 is prayer. I pray every day. My family and I, we pray over our dinner. We try to have family dinner as often as we can, all together. I didn't used to be spiritual, and I have found tremendous value in prayer, in understanding our deeper connection to this earth and to each other. And I have found prayer to be incredibly helpful in all aspects of my life. I'm uncompromising about working out. I get some form of exercise pretty much 7 days a week. I vary it, and I find that every aspect of my human body, my mental health, my physical health is so much better when I'm active and exercising. And the third, I would say, is getting outside. Getting direct sunlight is incredibly important to me, my mood, my connection with nature. And so I think a lot of our meta crisis is related to the fact that we've become disconnected from nature, from each other, and reestablishing those basic human connections. You should not underestimate how much value they have in making you healthier and happier.
Which is really incredible coming from you, who's, so focused on fixing the food system, and your top 3 things don't even include food, which just says how important all of these things are. It's not just one.
4 would be food. And I'm obviously insane with food.
I'm sure there's not just 3 things that you're doing, but all right. What is one thing you think would have a big impact, but you have a hard time implementing it or something you're working on?
Proper labeling. That's something that the administration is working on, but transparency is such a hot topic for the new administration. We want all Americans to have full information and then make their own choices. And as an example, genetically modified labeling has been a battle for over a decade. The food industry does not want to put it on the packaging because they fear that it will scare consumers and not buy their products.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. My view is let consumers make their own decisions, but be honest about what's in the food and how you made it. And telling people that you genetically modified animals to make this food, I think they should know that. So I think proper labeling of those kinds of issues will have huge dividends, but it's a big, big battle with the food industry.
Absolutely. And I think going back to your McDonald's example, I hear the argument all the time, well, I ate McDonald's growing up and I'm fine. People haven't been educated about how food has changed along the way. And it's sort of been this insidious, change and things creeping in that people don't know about.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Last question is, what does a healthy life look like to you, Jason?
I think most simply, it's being able to live into your 70s and 80s without being sickly. A lot of people are living into their 70s and 80s, but with many, many diseases, many pharmaceuticals. There's a very clear distinction coming out in the last 5 years on the difference between lifespan and health span. And so for me, it's having mental clarity and mental acuity. It's being able to feel decent every day. It's being able to be a good father, a good husband. It's being able to have the motivation and the energy to do the things I want on this planet. So health to me is obviously the most important thing that you have. And you can't do anything if you're sick. So to me, it's really about being able to do just the basic things that we think are innately human.
That's beautiful. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time to dive into so many more aspects, but thank you for sharing your story. And like I said, I think I can relate to so many aspects of it, and it's beautiful to see and just look back on all the ways you've been shaped to get to where you are today, to be able to have the impact that you're having on our food system and on our health. And, really look forward to seeing what we continue to do over the next few years and beyond. We didn't have a lot of time to dive into what you're doing with HumanCo, but where can people learn more about what you're doing there, the companies that you are supporting, and one of my favorites being True Food Kitchen, which I know is like the safe restaurant I can go to no matter where I'm traveling. And then where can people learn more about you personally?
My handle on social media is at HumanCarp, Karp. It's the same handle I have on X and on Instagram. Those are the primary 2 channels that I'm on. HumanCo.com, you can learn about our company and all of the companies we have underneath HumanCo. You mentioned True Food Kitchen. We have 6 different brands. that we are either owners of or heavily involved in. Everything we do has the same principles. Everything we do is gluten-free. Everything we do is seed oil-free. Everything we do is simple ingredients with no synthetics, chemicals, unnecessary additives. And we, similar to what we did with Hugh Chocolate, we want to be part of and responsible for companies, not just in food, by the way. Grove Collaborative is the largest marketplace online for non-toxic living. And it is a marketplace for where you can find all things not plastic, all things without forever chemicals, around personal care, household products, compostable garbage bags. So we're doing a whole ecosystem of things that just make it a lot easier for people not to have to be like Sherlock Holmes. If you go to any of the companies that are affiliated with HumanCo, you will notice there's a lot of trust. There's a lot of easy decisions, and you don't have to ask the hard questions like, who's really behind this? Where did they make this? What's their incentive? And so, please check out any of our companies. And if you want to try any of the products, each of the websites, we have an organic ice cream company called Cosmic Bliss,
which is very, very popular over at our house. The best ice cream I've ever.
And then we have a gluten and grain-free, seed oil-free pizza and bread company called Against the Grain. If you go to any of these websites, you put in your zip code, you can see where you can buy them and try them. It's True Food Kitchen. You can put in your zip code to see if there's a True Food near you. Grove Collaborative is online. And we also now have an organic baby food company called Amara, AMARA. It's the fastest growing organic baby food. And if you have kids that are 3 months to 10, there's some great stuff on there. They make these amazing smoothie melts that are no refined sugar, 100% organic. I eat them. So feel free to try them.
You don't need to be a baby to enjoy them. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining, Jason. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll do this again sometime.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. There is so much that Jason and I covered, but also so much more that we did not have time to get to. And I wanted to leave you with a few insights into how you can help support change in your local community and your local state. Several states have passed or are passing legislature to ban artificial food dyes and ultra-processed foods in schools. California and Arizona are two examples of this. Jason just recently spoke at the Texas State Senate with others, including Dr. Mark Hyman, who's also been a guest on the podcast, just last week, supporting similar legislature in Texas. You can view the video of Jason's talk in the show notes. There are more than a dozen states altogether that have legislation in process. And the goal here is to get the states to move faster than the federal change in order to increase the pressure for federal change. So if you're interested in helping to advocate for improving the quality of food in our country, starting with, most importantly, what our children are eating in school, especially because the quality of school lunches disproportionately affects underserved children who rely more heavily on school meals. So what you can do is first go to Google, find out if there's any legislation in the works in your own state. Next, call your state senator and support and advocate for change to school lunches. Advocate for change in your local schools, talk to teachers and administrators. And then finally, vote with your fork. The more that we all demand better quality food with what we're purchasing and what we're eating, the more our food system will be forced to change. Thanks again so much for listening, and hope you are able to take whatever action you feel comfortable with after listening to this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, please consider subscribing and giving it a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really does help to get the word out to more people.